Exodus 3, 1 to 10, 4, 1 to 5. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led this flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, that mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why this bush is not burning up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, here I am. Then he said, come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I've come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me, and I have seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Then Moses answered, but suppose they do not believe me or listen to me, but say, the Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw the staff on the ground, and it became a snake. And Moses drew back from it. The Lord said to Moses, reach out with your hand and seize it by the tail. So he reached out his hand and grasped it, and it became a staff in his hand, so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you.
The Gospel for today is taken from John chapter 5, verses 17 to 20. But Jesus answered them, my Father is still working, and I also am working. For this reason the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. Jesus answered them, very truly I tell you, the Son cannot do nothing on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. The Father he himself is doing, and he will show him greater works than these, so that you will be astonished. Amen.
It's been an on and off again journey to get here. Much uncertainty over the last 12 months due to COVID, and yet here we are today. We started this process nearly 2 years ago, and we had a team lined up from Poneke, from Wellington, ready to host a conference at Wesley Taranaki Street, and using the Michael Fowler Centre with thousands. And here we are today. Here we are. We had to shift. We changed and we reorganised, and we've been through a process which has brought us here to Wesley Papatauitaui. And I want to say thank you to Miss Alay and to the people of this parish for your generosity in making room for us and hosting us so ably. Much of it at fairly short notice, so thank you, we're grateful. I want to say a few thank yous because I don't know when else I'm going to get the opportunity. The difficulty is that I'm probably going to miss someone important. And so I apologize in advance. It is through no malice on my part. It is simply an aging memory which hasn't actually picked up everybody who is supposed to be thanked. This puts people under pressure. I want to thank David, where are you? Our outgoing General Secretary, and David Bush and Wendy Kerr. They put in a huge amount of work in keeping the thing just rolling along to get to where we are to today. The leaders of the Taha Māori. I've appreciated that we've walked together in this process, so this is where we are today. Edwin Etuini and his family. We haven't spent as much time together as we might, but he has discovered a wicked sense of humour, and we're going to enjoy discovering one another over the next couple of years. I want to especially thank the Reverend Dr. Susan Thompson. Where is she? She's hiding at the back there. Susan basically has done the heavy lifting on my behalf anyway. She did ask me when I asked her to be chaplain, why did you choose me? And I had a lot of things that I said, which everybody knows about, her warm presence, her competence, all those sorts of issues. But the thing was, I said to her, but also is that you're one person who doesn't mind telling me the truth about myself. And it's kind of important that I've got someone who's prepared to push back at me. So I've been very grateful for the way in which Susan has kept me on track over the last little while. I also want to say thank you to the people and the leadership of Opawa in Christchurch, where I've been hiding for the last 26 years. They are aware that my mind hasn't been 100% on the job for the last couple of years, but they have been very gracious and supportive nevertheless. Lynn and our three sons, Daniel, Sam and Luke, and our two mokopuna, are they still here? Okay. You would hear them otherwise, okay. Theo and Hugo. Two boys that are very different. Like, actually, our three sons, you would not believe that they all came out of the same gene pool, but that's how things go. And for those who have continued to pray for and support me and love me down through the time. Particularly those who've come to support me from Christchurch, our friends, Frank and for Mary. They're not together, they just happen to be together today. And I'm just grateful for your presence with us today. There were a whole lot of others coming up from Opawa, but they're all going to Wellington next week, and they've decided they're going to make a holiday of it. So, well, actually next week in Wellington was where the conference was planned. They got cheap tickets, so that's where they are, just so that you kind of get the joke. I just thought you might need to know. And to tie it around Nicola, thank you. Thank you for your patience, your kindness, your tolerance. Yes, over the last 2 years, the Pastoral Committee and President's Committee of Advice were 2 times longer than they probably needed to be when I was there. And they've been wonderful. So I guess for the next 2 years, we're going to be changing roles, and we're going to see how that all works out. It's going to be good though. So I'm really grateful. Thank you for your leadership, your able leadership and loving and gentle leadership of the church for the last 2 years. I also want to thank somebody who didn't get here today. He would have been, but I got an email this morning to say that his flight out of Nelson was cancelled. And that was the Reverend Tim Langley. Tim was, if you've got to blame any one individual for me being here, blame Tim. He was the minister, the presbyter at the Mornington Methodist Church when we came into it for the short time that we were there. And Tim was a person of grace and wisdom and courage, whom I have respected. And although that we've drifted apart, we're sort of reconnecting again, and I've come to again really appreciate the man that he has been, is, and will continue to become. One of the things that was a bit of wisdom that he talked about during his time at Mornington that I really appreciated. He said, while we may travel slowly, we travel together. And it struck me that there was something important about that. And being the sort of person who can create a bit of chaos along the way, I've valued that as a place to come back to. That we're committed to travelling together. We're being woven together to proclaim life. It is true, and many of you will be aware, that we face some significant challenges, both internally and I believe also externally, as we're trying to work out how we are the church at the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century. So now, I want to shift pace and talk about the readings that we had this morning. You'll see the title there, What's in Your Hand? That's not the theme for the presidency. It's just the title for today. What's in your hand? And what I want to do today is simply offer a way of seeing. A way that allows us to see beyond what for many of us appears a random, circumstantial, coincidental way in which we live life. To recognise and to discover that underneath of life there is purpose and there is meaning that might actually enable us as a church to chart a way ahead. It starts with the words that from the New Testament that we heard, the words of Jesus, I only do what I see the Father doing. I wondered for a long time what that meant. For years I thought, what does he mean? Does he have a pair of special spiritual binoculars that allow him to see into a realm that is completely hidden from me so that he knew what God was doing? That may be the case. But I think there is actually a more obvious answer. And that is that what God was doing in Jesus' doing was what was happening in Jesus' life. And I believe that's true for all of us. That what God is doing is what's happening in your life. It's what's happening in my life. Some illustrations. There were 4 friends who, when Jesus landed at Capernaum, brought their friend on a mat. He was paralyzed. They brought him to Jesus. They laid him down before Jesus, and Jesus looks into this man. He sees his need, and what are his words? He says, your sins are forgiven. Now you think, that actually isn't fixing the problem. The man is paralyzed. Surely that's what he needs fixing. But Jesus saw that the basic issue for this man was that he was paralyzed by his own sense of unworthiness. He needed to be set free. Now this isn't true of everybody, of course, that's paralyzed, but in this case, Jesus could see something. And when people asked him whether he had the right to declare forgiveness, he says, well, if you don't think I have, perhaps I can show you. He says, stand up and walk. And the man discovered that he could stand up, he walked, and he went home. What was God doing? He brought this man into Jesus' life. And Jesus, I think, is probably praying internally, okay, Abba, what do you want me to do? Well, I put him in front of you, you tend to him. There's a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. Jesus is surrounded by a throng of people. She works her way through and manages to touch the hem of his garment, believing that if she does that, she's going to be healed, and she is. You know the story well. Jesus senses something has happened. He looks around, who touched me? And they says, don't be ridiculous, everybody's touching you. But he knew. And this woman comes forward and he affirms the faith that she had. What is God doing? He's doing what's happening in Jesus' life. There's a man, in Matthew's Gospel, there's 2 of them, who's sitting against the wall of Jericho. as Jesus passes through on his last journey to Jerusalem. And he hears that it's Jesus. There's a large crowd. And what does he do? He gets up and he starts to shout at the top of his lungs, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And they try to shut him down. He just shouts all the louder. And over the noise of the crowd, Jesus hears the voice. And he stops. And he says, "Bring him here." What is God doing? God is at work in this man that we know as Bartimaeus, who is brought to Jesus. And Jesus attends to him in that moment. Jesus' job is to notice. It's to notice what God is doing. I want to suggest it's the job of each of us to notice. I no longer believe in coincidences. I don't. It's like when you go to the supermarket, you're at the end of the aisle and you see someone at the far end of the aisle and you think to yourself, do I really want to talk to them today? Or you think, I really want to avoid that person? So you've got two choices. You either go down the aisle where they are, or you go across a couple of aisles. None of you have ever done that, have you? It's true, it's what we do. I want to suggest to you that there's no such thing as a coincidence. That each one of these things, and I'm not talking about fate either, is an opportunity. Each one is an invitation. And we can say yes, or we can say no. We can go down to meet this person and see what happens, or we can find our way to another aisle and avoid them. Everything I want to suggest is a divine invitation. I don't believe, as I said, that there are coincidences. Methodism used to have a word for it. Providence. The providence of God. This unseen hand that is at work. How do I know that this is true? Well, I'll just be a little bit risky. I know it's true because of the people that I don't meet. You might think that's very odd. Well, some years ago I ended up in a situation which got a bit unpleasant with somebody who lives quite close to me. In fact, if I had Stephen Fleming's throwing arms, I could probably throw cricket balls on their roof. After the incident, I never saw them again. They still live there, until recently. But somehow, we never run into one another. And the few times, about 3 times in about 6 years that I've seen them, I've had a sense of God has always had something to say to me that has allowed me to move forward from a situation that was incredibly painful. It's not just about who we meet, it's about who we don't meet. Of course, it could be coincidence, but I don't think so. I've got some notes here. So, once we see this, I want to suggest is an opportunity to seek the grace of noticing. That's what I ask for. I ask each day, Lord, give me the grace to notice, to see what it is that you're doing. Help me to see and help me to step out in faith. Just ask for the grace, the gift of noticing. Because everything is an invitation. It's an opportunity. What God is doing is what is happening in your life. And it's what is happening in my life. And if we see that, everything changes. Life is no longer random, it is no longer pointless, it is no longer purposeless. It has an underlining sense of meaning and purpose. It is actually going somewhere. Now this brings us to Moses. You wondered how this was going to happen, didn't you? Here's Moses. How old's Moses at this point? Do you remember? He's 80. He's 80. A lot of us at 80 are thinking about, maybe soon we'll be hanging up our clocks. But here he is, he's in the desert. He spent first 40 years of his life as a prince of Egypt. Everything's gone his way. He's had it all. He's had the authority, he's had the power, he's had the mana. Everything he wanted has been his. The last 40 years he's been a refugee. He's been wandering around in the desert looking after sheep. Here's Moses. All that he had has gone. It's been taken from him. He no longer has any of it. His pride, his hubris, his arrogance, all gone. It's all been burnt off over the last 40 years. All the hopes and dreams, ambitions he might have had, all gone. And here he is. This is it. He's a shepherd, looking after a few sheep in a desert that he's become very familiar with over the last 40 years. And he sees a burning bush, but he notices that the bush isn't consumed, so he goes over to investigate. And he has a conversation with God. A conversation with God. A burnt out husk of a man, just a shell, and God looks at him and says, ready now for what I had in mind. And he tells Moses that he's going back to Egypt to bring out the children of Israel. Where? Here in the desert. And Moses says, I'm nothing. I had nothing to offer. He says, you and the stick are enough. You and the stick are enough. If it's your only resource, you and the stick are all I need. You need to go back to Egypt. So Moses, this burnt out 80-year-old husk of a man with his stick, goes back to Egypt. And he leads the children of Israel out into the desert. Thus goes the narrative. And Moses, this man who thought he had nothing, discovers that he has a whole lot of other things in his hand. A, he knows how Egypt worked because he lived there and he was one of its leaders for 40 years. B, he knows how the desert works. He's become an expert in surviving in the desert. And he's going to need that because he's going to be spending the next 40 years there with a group of people that he's leading around and through the desert. He uses what God has put in his hand. Moses and his stick. And what of us? What of you and me? My experiences in the church is that we so often spend time to be okay. If only we had who they have, if we only had the resources that that's right under our own noses, what God has put in our hands. As I said, I've been at Opawa, but that, as we can see, is coming to a close. After 4 years, we had a church split. It was a significant split. The church split right down the middle. And we lost 2 generations. We lost our young families. We lost our youth group. We lost pretty well, there was a little bit left, but the whole lot was gone. Most of them went off and formed what is now the biggest church in Christchurch, Grace Vineyard. Dave McGregor, who's their senior pastor, was my youth leader for 4 years. And he's a superb leader, which is why it's the biggest church in Christchurch, and they've got satellite churches all around the place. God's at work. God's doing stuff. But what about us? What was it left for us? Well, that first year after the church split, it felt like we were dragging our entrails around behind us. It was awful. Because we saw what we no longer had, what we'd lost. And it took us a number of years to realise that actually trying to get back what we had wasn't going to happen. And it took me even years more to realise that I had the greatest gift of all, which was a gift of an elderly congregation. A group of wonderful people who had experience, who had gifts and resources, who had time, who have things that they haven't yet lived out but would want to if they were given the opportunity. But so often we put them aside and say, well, just because they're old, they're actually not worth anything. we need to recognise what is in our hand. What are the resources that God has given us? I'm part of MCPT, the Methodist Connectional Property Committee. For the first year on there, it grieved me every meeting that we were selling another church, because we're closing churches flat stick left, right and centre around the country. The pace has slowed. I think we're probably running out of churches to sell, but I mean, the pace has slowed. But I've wondered if we'd ask the question, if we'd recognise that God is actually still at work among us, even though there might be a small number of us, if we'd ask the question, what is it that we have in our hands? What resources do we have? What gifts do we have? The truth is that a lot of people have developed gifts out of pain. People's passion often comes out of pain. There's something that happens to you, traumatic and awful and hideous. And as a result of that, God gives birth to something where you want to make a difference. Yes, no? They're all part of who we are, part of what the church is and is called to be. We need to recognise the gift of who we are, that everyone is capable of ministry. I have people on Sunday mornings coming in on Zimmer frames. A lot of us do. Does that mean because you're old and need support to work that you're incapable? Of course not. There's nobody that can't lift the telephone at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning and ring a friend and say, I've had you on my heart, how you doing? That's ministry. There's nobody that can't put their hand on the shoulder of the person next to them and say, can I pray for you? That's ministry. There's nobody that can't write a letter or cook a meal or do some, even what seems a small act of kindness. Just meeting somebody with a measure of generosity and kindness in the supermarket. That's ministry. It's ministry. And each one of us is capable of it. Each one of us is gifted, and is gifted differently. And I want to suggest that there is nothing in God's regime that is wasted. Even your most hideous and awful experiences, God can turn and use to make a difference for the lives of others and also for healing and renewal and setting you free. So rather than looking at what we don't have, let's look at what we do. Let's take an inventory in each of our congregations of who we are and of what we have, of what energy, what gifts, what resources, what skills, what passion there is among us. And we pray for eyes to see the opportunities that God is putting in front of us. Moses believed he had nothing to offer, but 80 years had uniquely equipped him and prepared him to be just the right person to lead Israel to freedom, to lead them out of Egypt, out of oppression, into a new place, into a place where they are prepared to start afresh, a new beginning. So the two questions I want to leave with you ringing in your own hearts and minds is, what is God doing in your life? What opportunities, what invitations is God making to you? And what is in your hand? What we've discovered over the last 12 months with COVID is that we had more in our hand than we thought. It has forced us to recognise opportunities that we hadn't seen before. Each of us have more than we can recognise. God bless you. We're going to sing, apparently. We are many, we are one.